Hello, my name is Julia Paquin, and I want to thank you for listening to my presentation on healing through Indigenous urbanisms. Before I begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I am situated and learning on the unceded lands of Tiohtià:ke, which have been traditionally cared for by the Kanien'kehá:ka people. I feel that it is important not only to acknowledge their presence and commitment to this land, but to honor it by putting Kanien'kehá:ka and other Indigenous leaders at the forefront of the urban planning practice. This process challenges legacies of colonial displacement by centering community, culture, and healing above profit-driven approaches of Western urbanism. My project will first give a brief history of Western planning, then explore how its principles have negatively affected Indigenous health in both rural and urban areas. With this context, we will then discuss how Indigenous urbanism seeks to dismantle these issues by analyzing examples of Indigenous planning. Before we begin, I'm going to give a brief definition of some urban planning concepts and vocabulary that we've brought up throughout this project. First, we have urbanism, which is how residents of urban areas interact with the built environment. Sometimes I'll use this interchangeably with urban planning, which is the act of designing a city and managing the land use because they are highly related. Then we have industrialization, which is the widespread development of industries and factories in a region, and its counterpart, deindustrialization, which is the decline of industrial production in a region. Then we have urban renewal, which is the large-scale redevelopment involving slum clearances and displacement. And finally, urban entrepreneurialism, which is a city operating as a business with the aim of making profit over improving quality of living. With this vocabulary, we can now explore the history of Western planning. This approach stems from a series of developments that prioritize profits over quality of life. This process began around the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, when cities developed around factories, creating overcrowded living conditions that were often deemed as slums, especially those populated by people of color. Then, around the 1950s and 60s, conveniently during the time when many Indigenous people were forcibly relocated into these areas, processes of urban renewal and deindustrialization began. As transportation technology expanded, it became more cost-effective for private manufacturers to offshore production to exploit cheaper labor, resulting in abandoned factories occupying valuable downtown real estate. This is when urban renewal and slum clearances ramped up. These densely populated communities were demolished and residents were given no compensation, forcing them to relocate into areas that lacked accessibility and social services, while their old neighborhoods were paved over and turned into freeways. This process of deindustrialization caused a shift to urban entrepreneurialism, when cities began to function as businesses that prioritized profit and foreign investments over improving the quality of life of their citizens. However, this led many former industrial hubs, including Montreal, into economic decline, as they've lost their main mode of income as many factories relocated. As a result, governments began de-investing in low-income, marginalized communities, cutting the funding to the already neglected social services. As we will explore in the rest of this presentation, this came with serious emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual health impacts for Indigenous people whose relationships with each other and land had been severed by constant displacement. Now that we understand the history of racialized displacement in urban areas, we can discover how this process caused and contributed to existing health disparities in Indigenous communities. For generations, Indigenous people around the world have experienced displacement, disinvestment, and social fragmentation as a result of intentional colonial practices aimed at removing Indigenous people from their land. From forced relocation of communities to the displacement of children through residential camps in the 60s scoop, colonial powers have severed Indigenous relationships to culture through forced assimilation into urban areas or relocation into less habitable lands such as the high Arctic. In rural areas, relocation reduced access to traditional medicinal resources, while formal health care was poor or non-existent. Meanwhile, in urban areas, Indigenous communities were facing disinvestment, making the quality and accessibility of healthcare very poor. In addition to healthcare services, many Indigenous people were denied mortgages and housing, leading to increased levels of homelessness, illness, and addiction, both in cities and on reserves. This caused widespread health issues across Turtle Island on top of the generations of colonial trauma that were already affecting Indigenous communities. The documentary Urbanisms tells the stories of Indigenous people who moved from reservations into cities through the voluntary relocation program in the United States from the 1950s to 70s. Now, the term voluntary is a bit of an exaggeration. It's important to understand that many Indigenous people were forced to move due to economic pressures intentionally placed on reserves, leaving relocation as their only option. Many interviewees, such as Marilyn Poirier, noted how isolating this process was. Poirier moved to an American city during a time of racial segregation, and she spoke about how her identity as an Indigenous woman felt forgotten. And this is a quote from her from the documentary. We looked for a water fountain, but what we found was two water fountains side by side. One said black and one said white. We had no idea which one we were supposed to use and what would happen if we used the wrong fountain, so we didn't use either of them. This quote illustrates a recurring theme with Indigenous identities in urban areas, a historical lack of consideration. Poirier also notes how she was housed in an immigrant community despite quite literally being a Native American. She felt unwelcome in both the segregated white and black communities. This forced relocation and isolation affected Indigenous health across all four dimensions of the medicine wheel: emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical well-being. Emotionally, the sudden loss of community and cultural networks resulted in isolation, loneliness, and grief, all experiences noted by the interviewees of Urban Res. Mentally, the pressure to assimilate into cities that disregarded their identities contributed to stress, depression, and intergenerational trauma. Physically, displacement came with reduced access to traditional healing, increased exposure to poverty and homelessness, overcrowded housing, and a neglected healthcare system in both rural and urban areas. Spiritually, displacement severed relationships to traditional lands, waters, ceremonies, and land-based practices that were central to Indigenous cultures. When analyzing the health impacts through the lens of the medicine wheel, the full scope of colonial relocation is revealed. It disrupted all aspects of holistic healing, not only access to health care, but the Indigenous relationship to health as a whole. This brings us to the next part of my presentation, where we study principles of Indigenous planning to understand how they seek to dismantle the negative impacts of colonial legacies. In response to the emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual impacts caused by displacement, Indigenous planning focuses on meaningful placemaking grounded in the restoration of relationships to land, community, and culture. Unlike Western planning, which has historically treated land as a commodity to increase profits, Indigenous planning focuses on conservation and sustainability of environmental, social, and economic levels. By centering communal governance, diversification, and self-sufficiency, urban planners create unique communities that uplift struggling households and allow for reconnection with land and water. In addition, Indigenous planning intentionally integrates green space and blue space, such as parks, rivers, and gardens, not just for aesthetics, but as a way to support land-based healing and environmental stewardship. These outdoor spaces can also accommodate ceremonies, storytelling by giving Indigenous communities meaningful areas to engage in cultural activities despite the density of urban areas.
However, the best way to understand these planning practices is by studying real Indigenous communities and master plans. David Thomas Nawi Odena, a Pigwe planner in Winnipeg, Manitoba, has created a master plan for the Kapyong Barracks site that perfectly illustrates principles of Indigenous urbanism. The first thing that stands out in this design is the integration of water and green space in the center of the community, giving members access to nature away from the busy urban areas surrounding the site. These spaces are as aesthetic as they are practical, functioning as storm and rainwater management to ensure the community is protected from harsh weather. Another important element is the diversity of mixed-use developments. Where Western planning merges residential and commercial functions for mixed use, this site integrates housing with social and educational functions, allowing for a larger population without reducing access to these services. The prioritization of communal spaces is another pillar of Indigenous planning, which gives residents a sense of stewardship and community. These spaces come in all forms, with sports and culture centers, as well as open green spaces that are surrounded by mixed-use developments, creating an activity node which fosters community and socialization. These diverse housing options also challenge Western planning, which usually results in communities dictated by one socioeconomic class. In this model, we see housing at multiple densities, allowing for households of different sizes and classes, making the community accessible and diverse. Seeing principles applied to real, large-scale master plans is incredibly inspiring and highlights how the integration of Indigenous voices into the planning process increases social, economic, and environmental sustainability. The Jericho Lands Project, seen in the visual formatting of these slides, is another example of large-scale Indigenous urbanism, reflecting many principles such as co-creation, housing diversity, and meaningful green space. This site is located on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. However, its ownership was transferred to the MST Partnership, which joins the Three Nations and the Canada Lands Company. The project works with the nature of the site by restoring forests and preserving water while implementing high-rise mixed development buildings and pedestrian paths. This layout increases active transportation by incentivizing walking or biking, reducing pollution and car dependency. This plan also includes options for affordable housing and employment opportunities, which helps reduce economic stress and creates more socioeconomic diversity. Given its location and connection to public transportation, this development dismantles patterns of colonial planning that displaced marginalized communities to neglected areas by centering them in proximity to the amenities of the urban core. In addition to its physical design, the Jericho Lands Project includes many community spaces that support Indigenous healing. The plan has an Indigenous cultural center that will host ceremonies and storytelling to promote cultural practices that will incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the daily urban experience. Other services include community gardens, child care centers, and healthcare facilities that foster social interaction and reduce stress on households. These services and other implementations show how Indigenous governance can reshape urban areas to prioritize well-being over profit, which forces us to reconsider the efficiency of Western developments. In conclusion, healing through Indigenous urbanisms requires more than questioning Western planning approaches. It requires centering land, community, and culture in the design of our cities. The history of colonial displacement impacted all facets of Indigenous health, but by planning through a decolonial perspective, we can take steps towards restoration. By prioritizing meaningful relationships with the land through the inclusion of green spaces, mixed-use developments, and co-creation, Indigenous planners create environments that support cultural healing. As inhabitants of urban space, we must fight for more Indigenous representation in the planning practice to continue to dismantle Western planning legacies and create developments that not only accommodate but uplift Indigenous ways of life. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. It was an honor to be able to combine these topics that I'm so passionate about, and thank you for giving me the resources to do so.